Okay. Um, so again, if you saw on Twitter, I am sort of running on uh, the edge of my seat, per se. I think there's somebody in here at least. Can you hear me? And I know the audio probably isn't great because I don't have my microphone hooked up, so it's just the computer's webcam mic, but hopefully it's okay. I guess we might as well just get into it. So I built this for like maybe half of December, and like a week in January I worked on this this little Reddit clone, really as an exercise, or at least I had some ideas I wanted to explore in sort of web UI work, and I wanted a project that I could use to explore those ideas. And I wanted something that had a lot of media, a lot of fetching of data. I didn't want to have to create the data. So basically, I needed a non-trivial project that I could use that could sort of help me work through these problems and give me a real use case. And the best one I really came up with was the Reddit API. It's not the most ergonomic API ever, but it is pretty robust and it is free. So that's what I ended up deciding to do. One thing about having it be Reddit is I can never really be sure what content is up, so don't judge me on what I click. I'm probably not actually looking at it. But anyway, a little bit about how the project is built. So it's a React project. It's a raw React DOM package, JSON. Yeah, just React DOM, and they're the alphas that have both hooks and suspense enabled. 16.7 alpha 2, and then I also have React Cache in there and Scheduler, which are sort of unstable APIs that will, well, sorry, I'm just adjusting my microphone volume a little bit. It looks like it's peaking. So the point is that, oh, okay, whatever I was talking about. React Cache and Scheduler, so those are unstable packages from the React core team that go with React concurrent mode and suspense and that sort of asynchronous data fetching. So this was an opportunity to fool with that, try to really put it through its paces. And overall, as you can probably tell, there aren't actually that many dependencies at all. I tried to minimize the number of dependencies. That was also another goal, was, okay, I'm going to build this client-side only app, no server-side aspect, at least that I'm implementing. Reddit API is obviously a server, but I wanted to have it deployed as just a static front-end if I actually do a full build. So everything goes into this public folder. It just takes a little while. And I'll get into, probably the first thing I'll get into is some of the build process, because a lot of that is also very custom. So it takes still a little while. Primarily because it's building actually 2 sets of bundles in parallel. And I'll explain what that is doing. Create a module. And build the service worker. Okay. So in public, you can see it's just HTML and JavaScript. Fortunately, it's all minified, so kind of hard to see. But yeah, and that's what you end up seeing, and really it's all about. Again, I wanted to try to. I personally believe that client-side only apps get a bit of a bad rap. Everybody's talking about server-side rendering and like Gatsby sort of build time rendering, and it's admittedly very cool. I find it a little limiting, and I don't think the benefits are as good as what people make them out to be. Primarily due to time to interaction metrics seemingly being ignored when people take this stuff into account. Whereas with the client-side only app, that is just purely JavaScript rendered. Like the time to visibility and time to interaction are the same no matter what. If you see it, it's already interactive. And I think that causes, or at least results in, less confusion, at least personally. And you can get like full JavaScript rendered client-side apps rendering pretty fast. Even big ones. And this is like a lot of JavaScript. I think I was checking earlier. I was curious. So I did this is a fun script or fun package that measures your flow type coverage. And yes, this project is done all in Flow. I can't give it up. It's just too ingrained in my workflow, despite its problems. I don't know if it's actually doing anything, but oh well. I think it's about like 10,000 lines of JS code, at least in my source folder. Just bring up the dev server again. So to go back into what I'm doing with the build. So the build is actually, this is sort of another thing I wanted to fool around with, which was I wanted to try to build an app, like an app that's built with Rollup, and see if I could create a workflow that worked for me. Because Rollup, like, well, it's pretty rough around the edges, at least compared to things like Webpack and Parcel. You get a lot of Webpack and Parcel have been focusing a lot on the developer experience. And Rollup, not to say that they aren't focusing on developer experience, it's just not as high a priority. They're more focused on the lower level tech, being the first one to implement any sort of tree shaking and being sort of ES modules by default made it seem pretty attractive. And so you'll notice I have a few roll-up config files. Let me know if the size is okay. It's kind of hard for me to tell. I'm on like a big iMac. But so if you see these various roll-up configs, this SW, this is just for registering the service worker. I put it in a separate file instead of inlining it into the sort of bundle, the actual app bundle, mainly because I was having issues with service workers. They're a huge pain. But then I have a module and no module, so I wanted to explore serving ES modules with a no module fallback with rollup, and I think there are some like Webpack plugins that do this. I don't know if Parcel can even do this yet, like by default. Rollup definitely does not have any turnkey solution. So what I ended up doing was creating two configs, and you'll notice that all it does is imports this config factory and sets a Boolean, which in the config factory, that Boolean is just saying, oh, is this an ES module build or not? And also, fair warning just for all of this, the code's pretty ugly. Like, these side projects are sort of an opportunity for me to just like code willy-nilly and not care about anything except, I don't know, keeping myself happy and interested. So yeah, some pretty ugly code incoming. And I guess this rollup config is a good initial showcase of that. So rollup does not hold your hand at all. You more or less need to do sort of set up everything manually. There's no sort of out of the box, oh, here's a comprehensive bundler configuration. It is not zero config. And so you have to do everything. So, I mean, input is pretty typical, except that I have this screens variable, which is, and I don't know if I'm going to even get to this tonight, but the various screens, whether it's a subreddit screen or a comment screen or an authorized screen, which doesn't actually have any UI, it's just for processing the authorization callback from Reddit. This code just gets all those file paths in this folder and adds them as separate, adds them as inputs or entry points to roll up, because I'm using code splitting and I needed to differentiate the screens as entry points as opposed to chunks, because I wanted to be able to distinguish a chunk from sort of a page, a distinct page, and putting them as an input sort of accomplish that. And you can already see, you've probably already seen that ES modules is used here, sort of, this is determining the output path, whether it's under the module or no module path, and then setting the format as either ES modules or system.js. A little bit of configuration. There's a lot of packages that just don't seem to work the way Rollup wants packages to work. So you're going to see a lot of sort of forming or manipulating packages in the Rollup config just to make it to get it to work. This being an example, sort of React icons references this at the top level, which is sort of ambiguous when it comes to JavaScript. So this is a configuration option in Rollup that allows you to say, oh, this is going to be like set it to window instead because we're going to be in the browser. And a lot of this is pretty typical rollup if you've seen it. It's not exactly the same as Webpack, but you have an array of plugins, and that's kind of where a lot of your processing and logic happens. One interesting thing, though, is so in the Babel configuration, I'm using the env preset, but this targets section is either it's actually using that ES modules argument that we get in to say, oh, do either the default Babel preset env or the default Babel preset env browser list configuration, or a browser list configuration specifically for browsers that support ES modules. So that ES module bundle won't actually transpile nearly as much, which results in a lower bundle size. Other things, I have this Babel plugin. I actually just added this today. A dev expression Babel plugin. This was actually just stolen. Not stolen. I have the license, so I think it's chill. From Facebook's FBJS package, which transforms _ dev to a sort of, place underscore to process env, node env production. And most importantly is that it converts invariant statements into, it basically allows you to tree shake sort of verbose invariant messages so that they don't end up appearing in production. Just a little sort of optimization, and it was sort of so easy to do, I figured why not. But anyway, so, if you want to see how much like rollup sort of is not great with traditional packages, like it's kind of ridiculous to me that rollup doesn't like work out of the box with React. And you can see here, because React exports CommonJS stuff, and it does it in a weird way. Rollup can't detect its exports, so you actually have to manually enumerate all the exports, which is pretty annoying. And I have to do that for essentially every React package, which is fun, but annoying. You have a bunch of dumb stuff, like, actually, Markdown to JSX. I'm no longer using that, so I don't need this. You know, if you're familiar with Webpack, this replace, rollup plugin replace, it's sort of similar to that, to Webpack's define plugin. Not exactly the same. It's more of just literally a string replacement, but hey. So we determine if it's production, and I provide the Reddit client ID and Reddit redirect URI as environment variables. They come in either a .env file, or you can use environment variables for that. And then here's where we get a little bit interesting. So this dev mode is actually pretty simple. It's a combination of the rollup plugin serve, which is just an HTTP server that gets started in the rollup config, and the rollup plugin live reload, which makes it so that it can trigger a page reload when so there's no hot bundle hot module reloading or anything like that, and I didn't really need it. Um, Maybe that's another slightly, maybe not overrated, but people put a little too much stock into that hot module reloading when a full page reload is generally pretty fine. Um, and this production variable, it's yeah, so it's really just actually checking if rollups in watch mode or not, and that's how it determines if it's a production build or not. I saw that pattern somewhere. It may have been like a rollup example repo, but so in this plugin definition, it's basically saying, okay, if it's not production and this is the ES module build, serve the public path. Main reason, it doesn't actually really make sense to do the no module build in development, because I mean, I'm a slick web developer. I'm not using browsers that don't support ES modules. So, and it gets kind of funky with some of these plugins if you're running them like 2 times. So I just said, okay, no module build only for this development stuff. And you see the same pattern for the live reload. And then if it's production, we run Terser. This is commented out. This is actually I was trying to use the Clojure compiler to get the bundle size even lower, but it currently has some issues. And then we have this module preload thing. So while I said this is a completely client-side app, that doesn't mean that I'm doing zero sort of pre-rendering. And what this does is, and honestly, like I threw this together so fast that I don't even actually really completely understand the API I created. But from what I understand, it's a mapping between a bundle's, one of the bundle entry point names, and maps them to a top-level HTML file. So saying the index entry point applies to all HTML files, like the files that are included directly with the index entry point. Those are included in all pages. Subreddit, or the subreddit screen. If you notice, we're at the index right here, and sort of the index screen, well, that's fun. That index screen, it's the front page, so it's technically a subreddit screen. So the subreddit entry point maps to both the index.html and the subreddit.html. Authorized to authorized, comments to comments. Pretty straightforward. And if we look at the public, you see those lowercase index subreddit authorized comments are there. And actually what this module preload does is it doesn't actually create the HTML files. It creates this JSON file, which is a mapping, which is that mapping between sort of the HTML name and the chunks that are sort of a part of that screen. And then my build script takes those. So the module preload config, this is where it's loaded. And I take the sort of HTML template, which is really just pug. and I generate all those HTML files with this template, and the big part that is being replaced and is templated are these link module preloads tags, so that the moment, because like these chunks are being loaded asynchronously through dynamic import, which means that it needs like that entry point to be downloaded before it can start or even know what the next chunks are going to be downloaded. What this does is sort of, I know, or at least I've configured that module preload plugin to give me the information that I need in order to generate HTML files that will actually preload all the necessary chunks even before they're requested. So it speeds up sort of the initial load a fair amount, I think. And if we look at one of these HTML files, you can see all the link module preload there. And then another sort of weird aspect of this is that all those JavaScript files are hashed, and so I also need to template out the sort of URLs for the modules index and the no module index, and you can see them here generated, and that's not actually done through the module preload JSON. That's just in the build script. I think I'm literally just, I'm globbing for index.whatever.mjs or index.blah.js in the folder. So nothing really fancy, but it seems to be doing the job. And then, just some other stuff like cleaning CSS files and what have you. The develop script, it generates a simple HTML replacement. It doesn't provide any sort of module preload, and then in the development build, where is it? In the entry file names, you'll see that if we're in production, we add the hash to the file name, but otherwise we don't, just so that it's predictable and I don't need to do any of that parsing. And yeah, so let's go back to develop. And if we look at the, oops. So this is the development, and you'll notice there's no module preload. And then in here, the template just generated the module index.js and no module index.js. This shimport, it's kind of annoying. I was under the impression that if you supported ES modules, you supported dynamic import as well, which is, from what I can tell, not the case in both Edge and Firefox. They both support ES modules, but don't support dynamic import. So what this is doing is doing a test of the dynamic import syntax, and if it's not supported, I fall back completely to the no module source, which is a system.js bundle. And so here we're adding the system.js script from unpackage and dynamically importing the fallback source, which is the no module source. And this only executes if the browser understands that type module. Otherwise, we just sort of download that system.js directly with the no module tag and just do that import. And then you have the service worker registration as a separate script, which I find helps out with recovery when things go wrong with service workers. It's not perfect by any means, but it definitely seemed to help. And then as far as routing goes, because I mean, in this case, it's just actually in development, it's a very standard SPA. So you have just index.html and it handles all traffic. If the module fails to load, So if the module fails to load, nothing really happens. You'll probably see a white screen. And that happens when there are some caching issues. It happened a lot a little bit ago. But as I've been I have a continuous deployment going on as I'm working on it. So it's actually being updated fairly frequently, and including the service worker. And so, and I always have tabs of it open. So it's a good test of sort of the resiliency of the service worker upgrade stuff, and it's been working pretty good so far. So I hate to have just a shit ton of error handling just directly in the HTML file. Not to mention, I do also want to. I'd like to try to add a fairly strict content security policy at some point, which means that, like, even then, I'm gonna have to get rid of these inline scripts and make them external and essentially separate bundles as well. And so it's just going to become a nightmare. Sort of if the main module loads, or the index entry point, I do have a top-level error container, which just implements componented catch. And it will render the error sort of just front and center. So if it's sort of subsequent modules, you'll see that error message appear because it will fail to load. And so that, I think, is a decent so it's deployed to now, and I decided I was gonna actually sit down and fool around with the now version 2. To say I'm not that much of a fan of it, well, it's weird. It's like I both think it's a large step backwards and a step forwards. Trying to be sensitive about this. Now, before was very very straightforward. You know, you could just do now without a configuration object and things would work, at least sort of simply. But now you need like all the examples they have up on their sort of examples repo are all really contrived and really simple. And so once it gets non-trivial, this sort of just grows and grows and grows. So this is where all the mapping happens. And we can see here, so here's the mapping of the authorized path to the authorized.html. So like every time I add a new screen or like a new entry point, I'm going to actually have to modify the now.json routing to ensure that it's handled. And I mean, I'm not a fan of the duplication that creates, because I'm also defining that mapping in my JavaScript. I wish there was maybe like a now.js file so I could like co-locate that information, but whatever. So yeah, and another important thing is that if you look at the builds, if you're familiar with Now 2.0, it has builders, and this Now static, it is just purely an upload builder. It doesn't actually run the rollup builds because their lambdas have insanely small size limits. And so what I actually do is build locally or in CI and then just upload the artifacts to Now. And really, like, that's sort of, I think, at least right now, it's Now's saving grace. Because if I didn't have an avenue for this sort of approach, it would not work at all. So what I actually end up doing is, I decided to fool around with GitHub Actions and GitHub Workflow. So yeah, so I have CI that, oh no, not signed in. Hold on, I'm going to sign into GitHub. Sure you don't see. Okay. All right, we're in GitHub. If you go to chonkit actions. So it's I think it's a pretty simple workflow. Install dependencies, test and build in parallel, and if they're successful, we deploy to Now. And if we're in the master branch, we alias the deployment to the sort of production alias. Pretty simple. And I mean, I've taken that approach in other projects, sort of not necessarily Now stuff. I kind of like that Now had, at least previously with their Docker stuff, had this sort of built-in builder, but now that the sort of static build just doesn't work for me, I don't know, sort of needs to do that. Let's get back to the dev mode. Yeah. So that's like deployment, and that was already a lot. So it was sort of doing stuff with rollup, experimenting with the link module preload tag, and sort of automating that manually. Like, this is what the module preload rollup plugin looks like. I seriously don't even know what it doesn't, or like how it does what it does anymore. I wrote it so tersely. It was like a day later I looked at it and I'm like, the fuck is this? So I hope it like just keeps working fine and doesn't break. So, but yeah, and also I guess importantly, I wanted to fool around with Rollup had, at least when I started the project, Rollup had its code splitting functionality sort of as an experimental feature, and I wanted to experiment with it. Now, since then, they've reached 1.0 and it's no longer experimental. But I still use like an experimental, they're optimized chunks. I actually haven't noticed it do anything. Maybe it will once the project gets bigger and I have more chunks. But yeah, I guess we can get into the actual code a little bit. I'm actually getting like really tired. So I need to think, what's a good one that I can cover quickly? Good aspect. I can explain a little bit about the project. As I mentioned before, it's done in Flow, and like, I mean, I go as far as, you know, in some areas I have just files that are just types that are exported. So that's fun and will massively decrease the chances of people contributing to the project, but no big deal. So I guess... Oh, and another important thing, so I am using CSS and JS for this, but it is the most basic version of CSS and JS in that it is all inline styles, or at least like 99% inline styles. I don't know why. At least for personal projects, that's what I prefer. It's the path of least resistance. It works. It allows me to sort of stretch my JavaScript skills and be clever there. And I'll show you what I mean. I guess we'll do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that and actually talk about theming, because this entire UI is themed. Now, there's no user interface for changing the theme. What it actually does, and what? Oh no. Hold on. Updates. Please, come on. Well, basically, what I'm saying is that the app is themable in that it actually listens to the OS to see. Oh, use layout viewport size. Oh yeah, I mean, I also have to mention that almost everything except for error containers, error components, error handling components, everything's using hooks. And I need to I forgot that so use layout viewport size is actually a sort of internal fork of Jared Palmer's use window size, but migrated from TypeScript to Flow, and with some adjustments. And this actually just reminded me that I should probably add his license to it, just to be a good citizen. And so and that's sort of like that use layout viewport size, that is sort of a testament to why using inline styles is important to me, is that flexibility. Like, there's no fooling around with it, sort of being concerned about, like, oh, dynamic updating, is that going to be performant? Well, inline styles, that is the most performant way to dynamically update styles. And if you just start at that point, it's completely client-side rendered. So the sort of like repetition of inline styles isn't actually going to contribute that much to the bundle size or to the HTML like being served, because I'm not doing SSR. So I don't really see many negatives to it. And it goes further than that, too. If we look at quickly the, I think it's the sidebar. So another thing that I do is, and it's going to be hard to show here just because I'm not on my phone, but it is notch aware, or at least the layout is. PEP, that's the pointer events polyfill. All sort of click, touch, and whatever events. It's done through pointer events, not click events, not touch events. And not all browsers support it. Safari doesn't support it yet. There's they have an implementation on their technology preview, but at least with this app, it's broken. So good reason why it's in preview. But anyways, getting back to, so these insets represent sort of the amount of space for the safe area, which dictates the area that's occupied by the notch in any one of the sizes or any one of the sides. And what this is saying, this sort of inline style expression is saying, is I have a layout margin, which is just a constant that's shared amongst its 16 pixels, but that's defining the padding both on the left and top. But in the case when there's a big old notch in the way, that might be larger than the sort of padding that I want. And I don't, like, right now I'm just using an iPhone 10, and even on the 10s, the size of the notch isn't different. So you would think, oh, you just hard code that. No, I don't want to make any assumptions about the size of the safe area inset, or safe areas. So in this case, what I do is the padding top is actually the maximum value between the inset's top and sort of my default value, which is the layout margin. And like, I remember WebKit when they announced the safe area insets being exposed to the web, they sort of paired it with their proposal and initial implementation of a CSS max expression. So, I mean, obviously you could do this in pure CSS, but I don't think it is nearly as maintainable and potentially dynamic, because the second thing doesn't need to be a static value. It could be a dynamic value. And so, and that use safe area insets, I mean, it's just that simple. A hook that handles it for you. I'm not going to go completely through how this one is done because it's actually kind of long and uses a lot of hacky shit. Yeah, it's almost 100 lines long. But it's a bunch of hackery on listening to custom CSS variables. But the bottom line is that, like, this is the hook, which is just a use state to store the current measurement, and adding a listener which is defined as a singleton up there, which updates the insets if the insets update while the page is open. Like if you switch from horizontal to vertical mode on your phone. And so if we go back to, so the theme, this is the use theme hook is literally just taking my theme context and using the use context hook, just consolidating it just so that I don't need to use context every single time. But if we go into context, go to the theme, each theme, again with flow, has a defined type. And the themes that exist are light and dark. And it's even further abstracted. It's kind of ridiculous a little bit, but it goes to this colors module. And there's sort of parallels. But I mean, it's not that many colors, and I think it doesn't look sort of monotonous at all. So what we do is we have a theme context. And we use a media matcher for the preferred color schemes dark. And we listen to that media matcher, which will update if it matches dark or not, and then get the theme key, which if it matches dark, it's dark. By default, it's light. And then we grab the theme using that theme key and provide it to the context. And then every time you're using a color in the code, you grab the theme using the use theme hook and like in this case, I technically like I make use of backdrop filter a little bit. I don't know if you can tell, like in the header here, sort of it's blurry, but I need progressive enhancement. So in this case, for the backdrop filter to work, the background color needs to be slightly transparent. So if it supports backdrop filter, it uses the theme's transparent blue background color, but otherwise it reverts to a opaque background blue color. And so that gets updated whether or not whether or not you're in light or dark. And if I actually what I can do is actually say I manually dark mode by not actually so yeah, it's just basically whenever you use a color, at least for the most part, you reference it from the theme. It wasn't going to be an extremely colorful app, so sort of a refined small selection of colors, and it doesn't really seem like it's going to get out of hand. And it actually there might be a benefit in that it could potentially discourage you from adding new colors, which might actually be a good thing. Or at least, like, you know, if you keep adding colors that are just being tweaked slightly, you know, slightly lighter or slightly darker, it sort of discourages that, and which ends up resulting, I think, in a more cohesive color scheme. But oh my god, I've been talking a while. So yeah, that's sort of like you're just grabbing a color from the theme, and again, sort of in the context, the theme context type, this is typed, and the theme context is typed so that it is the theme context type. So if we go back to the sidebar, let's say I mean, this is contrived, but if I'm doing theme dot, like, I have access to all the colors here, really easy, and if I misspell it, Flow's going to yell at me because it is not in the type. So yeah, Flow doing its job for error. Yep. Yeah, I mean, like, all this JSX looks pretty messy, but when you're using, like, when parts of the styles are static, you define them up top with, it's essentially like class names to styles, but it's just an object and an object name. And if you actually go in to the JSX, in the cases where I've done that, it still identifies the name. So it's like in my code, I can see, oh, this div is the sidebar container. And well, I don't see that in the inspector. You sort of see what a lot of people consider to be a mess. What you can see is, like, this is the sidebar container. What we're seeing here is the resolved. It's like going to computed, but you don't have all this garbage in the dev tools. It's like, this is the computed stuff. Like, you have some global styles that, like, I've defined for helpers, but like, this is the resolved computed style, just sort of right there. And I consider that more of a productivity boost than sort of any other aspect of using CSS. Now, that's not to say that I don't like CSS. CSS is fine. But when I'm creating a dynamic app like this, like if I'm doing a web page, then yeah, I'm going to use CSS because that's what it was built for, building documents. But if I'm building a web app, no, it's not dynamic enough, and it's not sort of intertwined with JavaScript as much. Because, so like, for example, I have, yeah, like I have merging styles as objects is unsafe. Yeah, but it doesn't, like, at least you're explicitly merging it, and usually explicitly merging it directly in the component. So if there's an issue, you know what component is the issue. And you can go there and see how it's being merged. And it's really no different than CSS classes overriding each other and sort of specificity. But then, like, for example, here, you're getting really intense with math. And while you might be able to use calc for this, it's a lot more natural feeling in JavaScript. And sort of, if you have it as padding plus padding top, CSS has the same exact issue. Yeah, I mean, that problem exists exactly the same way in CSS. They'd be inline styles, and no, CSS merge or object merging does have order. But anyway, I actually generally don't use shorthands at all. Again, this is all stuff that I like. These are things that I do for my personal projects. That doesn't mean that this is how I code at like my job. Definitely not. This is what I produce when I understand sort of how I work and how I work alone. And it seems to be working out pretty well. But anyways, yeah, some of the code is pretty ugly. Like, should I render the sidebar or should I render the content? That's an interesting. Let's break out the code sandbox. So an app, let's okay, so what I'm saying is padding is 20px, so that's all around, but then padding top is 40px. It'll just be to the top, right? This seems like what you're talking about. Let's remove the padding, go in here, do it as an inline style. And let's actually do it separately outside. Create two style objects, and we're going to have padding is 20, and then shorthand style. Hold on. Yeah, it doesn't do anything. That's expected behavior. So we go back, and I'm gonna add the shorthand style. So we're here, and the top style will be top is 40. Then well, that's the same behavior right there, right? And let's do the reverse. Oops. And that's the same behavior there. So I don't know what you're talking about. Behaves the same way as CSS. If we actually go here and look, padding ends up being 20. So the override, technically, the actual resulting CSS here is not the same, but the actual result of it is. And I believe that's actually React handling that, because if we take shorthand style and put it back above. So see here? So React, or this may not even be yeah, and I think it's important to curious. What? Sandbox. So if we actually look at the style declaration, so left, right. So it does look like React is resolving padding the shorthand. So what it likely is doing is, one, the keys are ordered, and two, what it might be doing, I don't know for sure, it might be reading uh, the shorthand, it might be converting that to all the longhand keys first. So when shorthand style is first, it's actually saying like, oh, padding top, padding left, padding right, padding bottom to 20. And then when you merge, when it sort of resolves the next style, padding top just overrides the top. So yeah, no, people seem to give inline styles a really bad rap. I want to give a talk about how powerful pure inline styles can be, and some of the stuff you can do with it, and sort of address some of the common complaints that people seem to have with it. At least inline styles paired with React. While in React Native DOM, I did a lot of manual inline styles directly with JS, sort of the raw DOM APIs. That still even wasn't that bad. But really with React is where it comes to shine, and like hooks are actually going to take it into the stratosphere. But I don't actually see it getting more popular than the trendy CSS and just JS libraries. And I mean, I have no horse in this race, so I don't actually really care. I mean, I'm just going to keep building cool stuff, and when people encounter the fact that I'm using just pure inline styles, and they try to recreate and some of the stuff I'm doing with style components. See, my issue is, and I mean, there also isn't enough actual evidence of this, but like if you look at those CSS and JS benchmarks, right? The baseline is always inline styles. They are the fastest. And I would probably argue that if you have a really dynamic web app, having CSS and like heavy selectors is going to slow down your page more than you think. When you use only inline styles, the browser has to do zero work to know what styles are applied to which element, because they're directly applied. Whereas when you're updating styles, you get that style recalculation sort of operation that has to be done on every frame. And when you're doing animations, like that stuff can add up a lot. And it's funny because I've been using inline styles forever, or at least like since I started working with React. And it was fun to know that I was talking to Jason Miller a little while back, a couple months ago, and he actually completely agrees. Using inline styles, write-only inline styles, so React makes it write-only, just because the source of truth is in React, not the DOM. That is the most performant way of updating styles, especially for dynamically updating styles. True. Consults the default browser styles. But that's the baseline for CSS and inline styles. So in CSS, you're adding selectors on top of those user agent defaults. And so those all need to be reevaluated. And I'm pretty sure, like, the browser is not that smart. Like, for example, like the browser does 0 or almost 0. I don't want to be absolutes, because at least at the moment I can't really provide hard evidence other than the fact that I talk to like Chrome engineers. But like no view culling, layout, unless you're using containment, which is experimental at best. Layout, updating any layout is going to cause the entire thing to update layout, the entire page to update layout, even things that haven't updated. And if that's the case, who's to say that style recalculation, every time you update a class name, add a class name to something, or remove a class name, or add a CSS style rule to the style sheet, I wouldn't be surprised that the browser is re-evaluating the entire page's style. So, like, these sorts of optimizations, at least when you're starting, and especially in benchmarks, like, don't actually appear. But in real-world apps, this stuff can be important. Now, I won't say it's important all the time. Sort of just use your best judgment. If it's a document, go with CSS, because it's not going to be updating a lot, or updating dynamically. But if your stuff's going to be dynamically updating a lot, I'd argue it's more maintainable and more performant than CSS. And like, I don't know what to say. I think that's a good, it's midnight. I think that's a good place to end on a rant about CSS and inline styles. This was fun, not as much of a train wreck as I thought it would be, but got a little rambly there. But thanks for watching. I will try to do this again sometime soon, maybe, I don't know. But until then, see ya.